Bogota, Colombia, March 1990. In a quiet residential neighborhood, a convoy of luxury cars pulls into an underground parking garage. Men in expensive suits step out, carrying briefcases filled with documents. This isn't a corporate meeting. It's the inner circle of the Cali organization, the most sophisticated criminal enterprise the world has ever seen. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers have built something different from their Medellin rivals. While Pablo Escobar wages war against the state, these brothers operate in the shadows, buying influence rather than bullets. Their operation spans 4 continents, moving product through networks so complex that even the DEA struggles to understand them. The brothers own banks, soccer teams, pharmaceutical companies, and radio stations. Their legitimate businesses generate millions while laundering billions more. In New York City, their distribution network operates like a Fortune 500 company. Regional managers report to area supervisors who answer directly to controllers in Queens. Every transaction is documented. Every courier is tracked. Every dollar is accounted for. The precision is remarkable. Unlike the violence that defines Medellin, the Cali organization prefers corruption. They call it plata o plomo, silver or lead, but they almost always choose silver. Judges, politicians, police commanders, and military generals all receive monthly payments. Their intelligence network rivals that of government agencies. They have informants inside the DEA, the Colombian National Police, and even the presidential palace. When the Colombian government finally turns its attention toward Cali after Escobar's death in 1993, the brothers believe they are untouchable. They have spent years building relationships with every level of government. They have donated millions to political campaigns. They have created thousands of jobs in their home city. The people love them, but the Americans are watching. In 1994, a young DEA agent named David Mitchell arrives in Bogota with a single mission: dismantle the Cali organization from the inside. He begins by studying their methods, their patterns, their weaknesses. He discovers that despite their sophistication, the brothers have made one critical error. They trust too many people. The first break comes from an unlikely source: a mid-level accountant named Jorge Salcedo who has grown disillusioned with the violence he has witnessed. Salcedo approaches the Americans with an offer. He will provide intelligence in exchange for protection for his family. The information he delivers is extraordinary. Floor plans of the brothers' homes, details of their security protocols, names of corrupt officials on their payroll, schedules of their movements. For 18 months, Salcedo feeds intelligence to the DEA while maintaining his position within the organization. He attends meetings with the brothers themselves, all while wearing a wire. The recordings capture discussions of shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They reveal the names of senators, governors, and police commanders who receive regular payments. In June 1995, the Colombian government launches Operation Cornerstone. Thousands of police and military personnel descend on Cali. The brothers scatter to their various safe houses, confident that their network of informants will protect them. But Salcedo has already provided the locations of every hiding place. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, the elder brother known as the chess player, is captured first. He is found hiding behind a false wall in his apartment, a space so small he could barely breathe. His brother Miguel is arrested weeks later, discovered in a similar hidden compartment. The sophistication that defined their operation had failed them at the crucial moment. Their arrests send shockwaves through the criminal underworld. If the Cali brothers could fall, no one was safe. But their network doesn't collapse immediately. For years afterward, their associates continue operating, moving product through the same channels the brothers had established. The infrastructure they built proves remarkably resilient. In Miami, a warehouse receives shipments that appear to be legitimate coffee exports. Workers carefully open the containers and extract packages hidden within the beans. The white powder is then distributed to networks across the eastern seaboard. This single operation moves approximately 200 kilos every week. The street value exceeds $4 million. The man running this operation is Carlos Castano, a former Cali lieutenant who has adapted to the new reality. Without the brothers' protection, he has forged alliances with Mexican organizations, particularly the Juarez Group, led by Amado Carrillo Fuentes. This partnership represents a fundamental shift in the drug trade. Colombians are no longer controlling distribution in the United States. That power has transferred to the Mexicans, who demand increasingly larger percentages for their services. Castano testifies years later about these arrangements. He describes meetings in Mexico City hotels where Colombian and Mexican traffickers negotiated terms. The Colombians initially resisted the Mexican demands, but they had no choice. Without Mexican cooperation, their product could not reach American consumers. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Meanwhile, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers faced justice in Colombian courts. Their sentences are remarkably light, a testament to the corruption they have embedded in the judicial system. Gilberto receives a term of just 15 years. Miguel receives slightly more. With good behavior, they could be free within a decade. The American government watches with frustration. They have evidence linking the brothers to thousands of kilograms of product shipped to the United States. They have recordings of the brothers ordering executions. They have financial records showing billions of dollars in laundered funds. But Colombian law prevents their extradition. This changes in 2004 when Colombia's extradition laws are reformed. The brothers, who have been enjoying relatively comfortable imprisonment, suddenly face the prospect of transfer to American supermax facilities. Their lawyers file appeal after appeal, but the legal walls are closing in. In December 2004, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela is placed on a plane to Miami. He arrives in handcuffs, facing charges that carry potential life sentences. His brother Miguel follows months later. For the first time, they will face American justice. Their trials reveal the full scope of their operation. Witnesses describe a criminal enterprise that at its peak controlled 80% of the world's supply. They moved product through submarines, fishing boats, cargo ships, and commercial aircraft. They owned entire fleets of vehicles dedicated to transportation. Their communication systems were more advanced than those used by law enforcement. One former associate describes the organization's hiring practices. Recruits were subjected to extensive background checks. Their families were investigated. Their loyalty was tested through a series of increasingly sensitive assignments. Only after years of proven reliability would someone be trusted with significant responsibilities. The organization's violence was surgical rather than indiscriminate. Unlike Escobar, who bombed civilians and assassinated presidential candidates, the Cali brothers targeted specific individuals who posed threats to their operation. Witnesses who might testify, employees who might defect, rivals who might encroach on their territory. These eliminations were carried out by professional teams who left minimal evidence. The brothers eventually plead guilty and receive 30-year sentences. They are confined to federal prisons where their influence means nothing. The empire they spent decades building has been dismantled, its remnants absorbed by Mexican organizations that now dominate the trade. But their legacy persists in unexpected ways. The methods they pioneered, the corporate structure, the sophisticated money laundering, the strategic corruption, have been adopted by criminal organizations worldwide. Their model of operating as a business rather than a gang has proven remarkably durable. In the years following their imprisonment, Colombian production continues despite government eradication efforts. New organizations emerge to fill the vacuum left by Cali's collapse. The Norte del Valle cartel, led by figures like Chupita, becomes the dominant force for a time before it too fragments under pressure. The violence that the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers sought to avoid eventually consumes their successors. The pattern repeats across the hemisphere. As one organization falls, another rises to take its place. The demand that drives the trade remains constant. The profits continue to flow. The corruption continues to spread. Only the names and faces change. Today, the structures the Cali brothers created still influence how criminal organizations operate. Their emphasis on intelligence gathering, their investment in corruption, their preference for negotiation over violence. These principles have been adopted by cartels from Mexico to Europe. They may be imprisoned, but their methods live on. The story of the Cali organization illustrates a fundamental truth about the drug trade. It is not simply a criminal enterprise. It is a parallel economy, one that operates according to its own rules while exploiting the weaknesses of legitimate institutions. Those who succeed in this world do so not through violence alone, but through the careful cultivation of relationships with those who hold power. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers understood this better than anyone. They built an empire not on fear, but on mutual benefit. They created a system where everyone from the farmer growing coca leaves to the senator receiving monthly payments had a stake in the organization's success. This network of shared interests proved far more resilient than any amount of firepower. Their ultimate failure came not from external pressure, but from internal betrayal. Jorge Salcedo, the man who brought them down, was motivated not by money but by conscience. He had witnessed too much violence, participated in too many crimes, and could no longer reconcile his actions with his sense of himself. His defection demonstrates that even the most sophisticated criminal organization remains vulnerable to the human element. No amount of security can protect against someone who has access to everything and decides to talk. The lesson has not been lost on their successors, who have implemented even more rigorous security measures. But as long as humans remain capable of guilt, remorse, and moral awakening, no criminal organization can ever be truly secure. The fall of Cali marked the end of Colombian dominance in the trade and the rise of Mexican power. This transition, which began in the early 1990s and accelerated after the brothers' arrest, fundamentally reshaped the criminal landscape of the Western Hemisphere. The violence that now plagues Mexico is a direct consequence of this shift in power. The methods have changed, the players have changed, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Product flows north, money flows south, and corruption spreads in all directions. The Cali brothers pioneered this system. Their successors have refined it. And despite billions of dollars spent on enforcement, the trade continues unabated. Houston, Texas, November 1999. In a federal courthouse, a man in an orange jumpsuit sits before a judge. His name is Osiel Cardenas Guillen, a former car thief turned drug lord who now controls one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations. The Gulf Cartel has operated along the Texas-Mexico border for decades, but under Osiel's leadership, it has transformed into something unprecedented. He hasn't just built a drug trafficking network. He has created a private army. The men standing guard outside his safe houses aren't ordinary criminals. They are former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, trained by American military advisors to combat drug trafficking. Now they work for the traffickers themselves. They call themselves Los Zetas, named after their radio code. Their defection represents the greatest intelligence failure in the history of Mexican law enforcement. These soldiers know every tactic, every surveillance method, every weakness in the government strategy. They have turned that knowledge against the state that trained them. The story of how this happened begins years earlier, in the dusty border town of Matamoros. Juan Garcia Abrego built the Gulf Cartel into a major force during the 1980s. He established the plaza system, charging fees to anyone who wanted to move product through his territory. His connections reached into the highest levels of Mexican government. Presidents, generals, and governors all received payments from his organization. Garcia Abrego pioneered the practice of accepting product as payment rather than cash. Colombian suppliers would give him half their shipment instead of paying transportation fees. This arrangement transformed the Gulf Cartel from a service provider into a major distributor. Their profits multiplied exponentially. By the early 1990s, Garcia Abrego was moving 4 tons of product into the United States every month. His distribution network stretched from Texas to New York. His money laundering operations involved banks in Mexico, the United States, and the Caribbean. The FBI eventually placed him on their 10 most wanted list, the first drug trafficker to receive that designation. His downfall came through betrayal. In January 1996, Mexican authorities captured him in Monterrey after receiving intelligence from informants within his organization. He was immediately extradited to the United States, where he faced trial on 57 counts of drug trafficking and money laundering. The jury convicted him on all counts. He received 11 consecutive life sentences. His imprisonment created a power vacuum that sparked years of internal warfare. Various factions within the Gulf Cartel fought for control. The violence claimed dozens of lives. Matamoros became a battleground where gunfights erupted in broad daylight. Into this chaos stepped Osiel Cardenas Guillen. Unlike his predecessor, Osiel had risen through the ranks from nothing. He started as a teenage car thief, stealing vehicles and driving them across the border. His mechanical skills and willingness to take risks brought him to the attention of Gulf Cartel recruiters. He proved himself through increasingly dangerous assignments. By his late 20s, Osiel had become a trusted lieutenant. He oversaw transportation routes and managed relationships with Colombian suppliers. He also developed a reputation for extreme violence. Those who crossed him disappeared without trace. When the leadership vacuum emerged, Osiel moved decisively. He eliminated his rivals one by one, using a combination of violence and strategic alliances. By 1999, he had consolidated control over the entire organization. But Osiel understood that his position remained precarious. Other cartels were constantly probing for weaknesses. Government forces, under pressure from the United States, were intensifying their operations. He needed protection that ordinary criminals could not provide. The solution came through an unlikely connection. Arturo Guzman de Quena was a lieutenant in the Mexican Army's elite Grupo Aeromoval de Fuerzas Especiales. These special forces soldiers received training from American, French, and Israeli military advisors. They learned counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence gathering, and advanced weapons handling. Guzman de Quena had grown disillusioned with military service. The pay was poor. The corruption was pervasive. His commanders regularly accepted bribes to look the other way while traffickers operated freely. He watched as his fellow soldiers risked their lives for a government that seemed indifferent to their sacrifices. Osiel recognized an opportunity. He approached Guzman de Quena with an offer. Leave the military and bring your most trusted colleagues. The salary would be 10 times what the army paid. The benefits would include houses, cars, and protection for their families. In exchange, they would provide security for the Gulf Cartel's operations. Guzman de Quena accepted. Over the following months, he recruited approximately 30 soldiers from elite units across Mexico. These men brought not just their training, but their equipment. Military-grade weapons, communication devices, and tactical vehicles all found their way into the Gulf Cartel's arsenal. The Zetas quickly established themselves as the most fearsome force in Mexican organized crime. They implemented military discipline within the cartel's ranks. They conducted surveillance operations that rivaled those of government agencies. They trained ordinary recruits in combat tactics. Their reputation spread throughout the criminal underworld. Other cartels watched with concern as the Gulf organization's capabilities expanded dramatically. The Zetas introduced innovations that transformed the nature of Mexican organized crime. They established training camps where recruits learned weapons handling, hand-to-hand combat, and tactical movement. They created intelligence networks that monitored police and military communications. They developed counterintelligence protocols to identify informants within their ranks. Perhaps most significantly, they changed the relationship between traffickers and territory. Previously, cartels had focused primarily on controlling smuggling routes. The Zetas expanded this concept to include complete territorial control. They established checkpoints on highways. They monitored all economic activity within their zones. They collected taxes from legitimate businesses as well as criminal enterprises. This transformation had profound consequences for ordinary Mexicans. Communities that had previously been peripheral to the drug trade now found themselves under cartel control. Business owners paid regular extortion fees. Those who refused faced kidnapping, torture, or death. Local police forces, outgunned and outmanned, either cooperated or were eliminated. The Mexican government initially underestimated the threat. Officials viewed the Zetas as simply another criminal group, albeit one with better training. They failed to recognize that these former soldiers had fundamentally changed the balance of power between the state and organized crime. In March 2003, the DEA orchestrated an operation that brought these tensions to a head. Working with Mexican authorities, they planned to arrest Osiel Cardenas at a ranch in Tamaulipas. The operation began smoothly. Mexican soldiers surrounded the property and prepared to move in. But the Zetas had been monitoring military communications. They knew the raid was coming. When the soldiers advanced, they found themselves facing their former colleagues. The Zetas had fortified the position and prepared defensive lines. A standoff ensued that lasted several hours. The Mexican military, reluctant to engage fellow soldiers, eventually withdrew. Osiel escaped. This incident demonstrated that the Gulf Cartel had achieved a level of military capability that the Mexican state struggled to counter. The Zetas could match government forces in terms of training, equipment, and tactical expertise. The implications were terrifying. 8 months later, in November 2003, Mexican authorities finally captured Osiel. The operation required hundreds of soldiers and resulted in a prolonged gunfight. Several Zetas were killed defending their leader. Osiel himself was wounded before being taken into custody. His imprisonment should have weakened the Gulf Cartel. Instead, it accelerated the Zetas' evolution into an independent force. With their patron behind bars, the former soldiers began operating on their own behalf. They maintained their alliance with the Gulf Cartel, but increasingly pursued their own interests. The arrangement worked for several years. The Zetas provided security while the Gulf Cartel managed trafficking operations. Profits were shared according to negotiated formulas. Both sides benefited from the partnership, but tensions gradually accumulated. The Zetas believed they deserved a larger share of the profits. They were, after all, the ones risking their lives in confrontations with both government forces and rival cartels. The Gulf leadership resisted these demands, unwilling to cede control. In 2010, the alliance collapsed entirely. The Zetas declared independence and launched a war against their former partners. The resulting violence exceeded anything Mexico had previously experienced. Entire towns became battlegrounds. Mass graves containing dozens of bodies were discovered throughout northeastern Mexico. The death toll reached into the thousands. The Zetas' military background shaped their approach to this conflict. They treated the war as a counterinsurgency campaign, seeking to control territory and terrorize populations into submission. They massacred migrants, believing some might be recruited by rival cartels. They attacked buses carrying passengers, searching for enemies among the travelers. They hung bodies from bridges as warnings to anyone who might oppose them. The Gulf Cartel responded by allying with the Sinaloa organization. This partnership, which would have been unthinkable years earlier, reflected the existential threat the Zetas posed. Former enemies united against the common danger represented by these former soldiers turned criminals. The Mexican government, meanwhile, struggled to respond effectively. President Felipe Calderón had launched a military offensive against the cartels in 2006, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers to combat trafficking organizations. But the Zetas proved uniquely difficult to counter. They could match military units in tactical capability. They had intelligence networks that provided advance warning of operations. They had no hesitation about engaging government forces directly. The violence reached levels that shocked even experienced observers. In 2011, Zetas members stopped 2 buses in the state of Tamaulipas. They forced the passengers off and systematically executed them. 193 people died in what became known as the San Fernando Massacre. Many of the victims were migrants from Central America traveling north toward the United States. The Zetas had killed them simply because they refused to work as drug mules, or because the organization suspected them of ties to rivals. The brutality served a purpose. It created terror that discouraged resistance. Communities learned that opposing the Zetas meant certain death, not just for individuals, but for entire families. This strategy of terror proved remarkably effective at establishing control over territory. But it also generated backlash. The Mexican public, horrified by the massacres, demanded stronger government action. International pressure intensified. The United States, which had largely focused its attention on the Sinaloa organization, began targeting the Zetas with increased resources. In 2012, Mexican Marines killed Heriberto Lazcano, one of the original Zetas founders who had risen to lead the organization. His death represented a significant blow, but the group continued operating. The decentralized structure they had developed proved resilient. Regional commanders could function independently, maintaining operations even when leadership was disrupted. The Zetas' legacy extends beyond their own organization. Their innovations, particularly the militarization of cartel operations and the emphasis on territorial control, have been adopted by criminal groups throughout Mexico and Central America. The template they created continues to shape organized crime across the hemisphere. Their story illustrates a fundamental vulnerability in anti-drug strategies. When governments train elite military units without addressing corruption and institutional weakness, they risk creating the very threats they seek to combat. The soldiers who became Zetas represented millions of dollars in training investment. That investment ultimately benefited not the Mexican state, but its criminal adversaries. Meanwhile, the drug trade itself continued largely unaffected by the violence. Products still flowed north across the border. Money still flowed south. Consumers in the United States remained largely unaware of the carnage their purchases funded. The markets that drove the trade remained as robust as ever. The story of the Zetas connects directly to broader patterns in the evolution of Mexican organized crime. As one organization rises and falls, others adapt and evolve. The Sinaloa Federation, which had dominated much of the western trafficking routes, watched the Zetas' methods carefully. They learned from both the successes and the failures. El Chapo Guzman, imprisoned when the Zetas first emerged, continued directing operations from behind bars. His organization maintained a different approach, preferring corruption to confrontation when possible. They invested heavily in relationships with government officials rather than military capability. This strategy proved more sustainable in the long term. The Sinaloa Federation faced less direct pressure from government forces. Their lower profile meant fewer headlines and less political pressure for action. They could operate more freely while the government focused its resources on the more visible threat posed by the Zetas. But the Sinaloa organization also recognized the need for military capability. They developed their own armed wing, though never matching the Zetas in terms of training or discipline. They recruited from different sources, often drawing on local criminal networks rather than military personnel. The balance of power shifted repeatedly over the following years. The Zetas fragmented into competing factions. The Gulf Cartel rebuilt some of its former strength. New organizations emerged to fill vacuums created by government operations. Through all these changes, the fundamental dynamics of the drug trade remained constant. Product moved through established corridors, adjusting routes in response to enforcement pressure, but never stopping entirely. Profits flowed to whoever controlled the plazas. Violence flared whenever control was contested. The human cost of this system defies calculation. Tens of thousands have died in drug-related violence since 2006. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced from their homes. Communities have been destroyed. Families have been shattered. Trust in government institutions has eroded as corruption has been repeatedly exposed. Yet the trade continues. American demand for drugs remains steady despite decades of enforcement efforts. Prices have remained relatively stable, suggesting that supply has kept pace with interdiction. The economics that drive the trade prove more powerful than any law enforcement strategy. This reality has prompted some observers to call for fundamental changes in approach. They argue that prohibition itself creates the conditions for organized crime to flourish. By criminalizing substances that millions of people want to consume, governments create enormous profit opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. Supporters of this view point to the end of alcohol prohibition in the United States. When the constitutional amendment banning alcohol was repealed in 1933, the criminal organizations that had grown rich from bootlegging lost their primary revenue source. Violence associated with the alcohol trade declined dramatically. Similar outcomes, they argue, could follow from drug policy reform. Critics counter that drugs pose different risks than alcohol. They point to the devastating effects of addiction and the public health challenges that would follow widespread drug availability. They argue that organized crime would simply shift to other activities, as indeed it has in many cases. This debate continues without resolution. Meanwhile, the violence persists. The trade adapts. And the organizations that profit from it continue evolving. The Zetas may have fragmented, but their methods have spread. The militarization they pioneered has become standard practice throughout Mexican organized crime. In Central America, the impact has been equally profound. Criminal organizations modeled on Mexican cartels have established themselves throughout Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They employ similar methods, combining drug trafficking with extortion, kidnapping, and territorial control. The violence they generate has transformed these countries into some of the most dangerous places on Earth outside of active war zones. Hundreds of thousands of Central Americans have fled north, seeking safety in Mexico and the United States. Their journey takes them through territory controlled by the very organizations they are fleeing. Many fall victim to kidnapping, extortion, or murder along the way. Those who survive face uncertain prospects in countries increasingly hostile to their presence. The connections between drug trafficking, migration, and violence form a complex web that defies simple solutions. Policies designed to address one aspect often worsen others. Increased border enforcement, for example, raises the fees charged by smugglers and increases the dangers faced by migrants. Crackdowns on one trafficking route simply shift activity to others. The story that began in Matamoros with Juan Garcia Abrego has now spread across an entire hemisphere. The template he established, combining drug trafficking with corruption and violence, has been replicated and refined by his successors. The Zetas took it further than anyone had imagined possible, demonstrating that criminal organizations could match states in military capability. That demonstration changed everything. Today, Mexican organized crime represents a threat not just to public safety, but to the stability of government institutions themselves. The corruption that enables the trade has penetrated every level of Mexican society. Police, prosecutors, judges, mayors, governors, and federal officials have all been implicated in cartel activities. The line between legitimate government and criminal organization has blurred in ways that may take generations to address. For the United States, these developments pose challenges that extend far beyond drug policy. The instability on its southern border affects migration patterns, trade relationships, and national security considerations. The weapons that flow south, purchased legally in American gun shops and trafficked illegally across the border, fuel the violence that drives people north. The relationship between the two countries has never been more complex or more consequential. Back in that Houston courtroom, Osiel Cardenas Guillen eventually faced American justice. After years of legal maneuvering, he was extradited to the United States in 2007. He pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and threatening federal agents. His sentence, 25 years in federal prison. From his cell, he watches as the organization he built continues without him. The Gulf Cartel has been reduced in strength, but still operates. The Zetas, the army he created, have fragmented, but their methods persist. The violence he helped unleash continues to claim lives daily. His story is not unique. Across Mexico, criminal leaders have followed similar trajectories. They rise through violence and cunning. They build empires based on corruption and fear. They are eventually captured or killed. And the trade continues regardless. The system proves more durable than any individual. The pattern suggests that focusing on individual leaders, however satisfying it may be for headlines and political purposes, does little to address the underlying dynamics that drive the drug trade. New leaders always emerge. New organizations always form. The profits available to those willing to take the risks prove irresistible. Some analysts have concluded that the only lasting solution lies in addressing demand. As long as millions of Americans want to purchase illegal drugs, there will be organizations willing to supply them. The profits are simply too large to resist. No amount of enforcement can overcome the basic economics of supply and demand. Others argue for different approaches. Community-based interventions. Treatment programs that address addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal matter. Social investments in the communities that supply cartel recruits. Economic development that provides alternatives to criminal employment. These approaches have shown promise in limited trials, but they require sustained commitment and resources that governments have been unwilling to provide. The political incentives favor visible enforcement actions over long-term prevention strategies. Arresting drug lords generates headlines. Building schools in marginalized communities does not. So the cycle continues. Leaders are captured. Organizations fragment. New leaders emerge. Violence flares. Products flow. Money accumulates. Lives are destroyed. And through it all, the trade persists. The Zetas represent perhaps the most extreme manifestation of this cycle. Their military origins and methods pushed the boundaries of what criminal organizations could achieve. They demonstrated that with sufficient training and resources, drug traffickers could challenge states directly. That demonstration has changed calculations throughout the criminal world. Organizations that might previously have avoided direct confrontation with government forces now consider it an option. The boundaries that once contained organized crime have been breached. The precedent set by the Zetas cannot be unset. This is their most lasting legacy. Not the territory they controlled or the profits they accumulated, but the proof that military-grade violence could be successfully employed by criminal organizations. Others have learned from their example. The arms race between states and criminal organizations continues to escalate. Governments respond with increased militarization of their own. They deploy soldiers rather than police. They employ tactics developed for counterinsurgency warfare. They accept civilian casualties as collateral damage in a war against crime. These responses often prove counterproductive. Military forces lack the training for law enforcement operations. Their presence in communities generates resentment. Their tactics violate human rights norms. Their operations often cause more harm than they prevent. The militarization of anti-drug efforts has not reduced drug trafficking. It has not eliminated criminal organizations. It has not brought peace to affected communities. What it has done is normalize violence as a tool of policy and erode the distinction between military and police functions. The consequences of this erosion extend far beyond drug policy. The tactics developed for use against cartels have been adopted for other purposes. The surveillance technologies have been turned against journalists and human rights defenders. The acceptance of civilian casualties has lowered standards throughout law enforcement. The damage to democratic institutions may prove more lasting than the damage caused by the drug trade itself. These are the stakes involved in the ongoing confrontation between states and organized crime. The choices made today will shape societies for decades to come. The examples set by both sides will influence how future conflicts are conducted. The precedents established will prove difficult to reverse. In this context, the story of a small group of soldiers who traded their uniforms for cartel employment takes on broader significance. The Zetas demonstrated what becomes possible when trained military personnel enter the criminal world. They showed that the skills intended to protect states could be turned against them. They proved that the line between defender and threat is thinner than most would like to believe. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of investing in military capabilities without addressing the conditions that make criminal employment attractive. Training soldiers while leaving them vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations proves worse than useless. It actively strengthens the very threats it was meant to counter. This lesson has application beyond Mexico. Throughout the developing world, military and police forces face similar temptations. Low pay, poor conditions, and rampant corruption make criminal employment appealing. The skills provided through international training programs can easily be redirected toward criminal purposes. Addressing this vulnerability requires more than better vetting or improved pay, though both would help. It requires fundamental changes in how security forces are structured and how they relate to the communities they serve. It requires building institutions that command genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. It requires creating alternatives that make criminal employment less attractive. These are long-term challenges that resist quick solutions. They require sustained commitment across political cycles. They demand resources that compete with other priorities. They depend on political will that is often lacking. In the meantime, the violence continues. The trade persists. The organizations evolve. And the human cost accumulates daily. The story of the Zetas is not over. Though fragmented and weakened, elements of the organization continue operating. Their methods have been adopted by competitors and successors. Their influence persists even as their formal structure has disintegrated. They remain a presence in the territories they once controlled, though their power has diminished. The Gulf Cartel they once served has similarly persisted despite repeated setbacks. New leaders have emerged to replace those captured or killed. Alliances have shifted as circumstances have changed. The organization has adapted to new realities while maintaining its core business of moving drugs across the border. The positions themselves must be eliminated. This recognition has begun influencing policy discussions in some quarters. Conversations about legalization and regulation of some substances have moved from the margins toward the mainstream. Discussions of development assistance to drug-producing regions have gained traction. Recognition of the role that American demand and American weapons play in fueling violence has become more widespread. Whether these discussions lead to meaningful policy change remains to be seen. The political obstacles are substantial. The interests that benefit from current arrangements are powerful. The momentum of existing approaches is difficult to reverse. But the costs of continuing on the present course are also becoming clearer. The death toll mounts. The corruption spreads. The institutions decay. At some point, the unsustainability of current approaches will force reconsideration. Whether that point has been reached or lies still in the future, only time will tell. For now, the trade continues. The violence persists. The organizations adapt. And the story goes on.